has this language of common grace for the common good pretty deep for me. I'll talk more about it today and tomorrow. And my thesis would be that you have a theology that can account for both common grace and common good. It's hard to think more coherently about the meaning of faith for life. Because we stumble over, as last night we heard from Patrick, over dualism, over the separation of my life from my faith, because I can't quite figure out how to put them together. Unless we have a theology that can account for both common grace and common good. So when you have, on these walls, photos of a barber and construction people in a house over here, and these, palmetto pine roses, and ordinary folks on ordinary streets, and you begin to realize that, when God, spoke through the prophet Jeremiah a long time ago, and these inspired words of God to the exiled people who were living in Babylon, this iconic, worst city in the history of the world. Babylon! Of course, that's what it is. Babylon! Almost a curse word that has become over the centuries. And he says to the exiled people who were whom? They were Daniel, and Meshach, and Abednego, and all these thousands of exiled Israelites who were living where? In Babylon. And God says through the prophet Jeremiah, seek the flourishing of your city. Pray for the flourishing of your city. I want you to build houses. I want you to plant trees. I want you to get married and have children, because you see, unless your city flourishes, you won't flourish. So pray for your city to flourish. You think, well, how would you pray for Babylon to flourish? Well, it's the worst city in the history of the world. You can imagine, maybe having a refined character of this city mansion on the water, as Pat Conway has described Charleston. Beautiful Charleston, South Carolina as it is. Maybe you think, well, this is the worst city in the world. But Babylon was described that way. We know it to be that way. But God says, pray for Babylon to flourish. So why does it flourish? How does it flourish? By planting trees, by building houses, by living an ordinary life. These common, ordinary graces, because common means that, ordinary graces, for the common good, like having a barber who does a good job. You think, I know when I go to the barber, I think, this is a good gift to me. 15 minutes in the chair like this, having somebody do this to me, and even though I have fewer and fewer hairs in my hair as we use the time, I think, well, I'm grateful to sit in the chair by somebody who I trust to one more time do a good job. I know she will. I'm not scared she's going to miss this or do this, and I'll think, I'll go ahead and come here today, because she knows me and I know her. To have somebody, underneath the city's, streets and puts together pipes and cables, and you think, well, we all depend on somebody doing a good job. And if they don't do it, we all suffer, don't we? We don't flourish, to put in a good word here. If somebody actually is under the streets, and you think, well, it doesn't really matter, I'm just tying this together and putting this pipe together with that, and why would it matter if I don't do a good job after all? I grew up in a time of American history where Detroit was actually the barometer of how we were doing socially, economically. You go to California, a long ways from Detroit, Michigan. In my world, it was like, how did the big three do? How were they doing? Because in some ways it was a barometer of how we were doing as a national economy. The moment, of course, not so long ago, when the great titans of the big three flew in their private jets to Washington, D.C. to the U.S. Senate and said, we're broke, we're bankrupt. What happened to Detroit? What happened to Detroit, to put it candidly, starkly, and summarily, is that they had, over the course of the 20th century, created a way to make cars where those who made the cars hated their work. And so the local wisdom in Detroit was, don't buy a Friday car or a Monday car. Why was that? Well, because on Friday, it was next to the weekend. You see, tomorrow was the weekend. People lived for the weekends. And people knew that they didn't stop making good cars on Friday. On Monday, they either, because of course they were so bummed having to come back to work on Monday, they didn't make good cars either. So buy a Wednesday serial number was the local wisdom on the streets of Detroit. Well, you can't do that for very long. What happens when you do? People say, I think I'll buy a Toyota instead. I think I'll buy a Nissan instead. And you just can't do it very long. People, it eventually catches up with you. So we don't, do things carefully, honorably, with a certain excellence that somehow remembers that even so the ordinary life, putting pipes together matters for all of us. We're going to flourish together. What? We don't flourish, actually, we just don't do well. So I love the photographs, because it's a reminder that the ordinary things we do day by day matter for our flourishing. So good for you guys for taking these words off your website. Common grace, common good are visually, on the walls of your very building here. So good for you. So how was last night? How were you in the sleeping and the wondering and the questions you might have come out of last night? Where are you this morning? Where are we together this morning? Anything we should talk about together today?
Well,
Yes, sir.
you said that my brain doesn't do too well
Yeah, it
sometimes.
does.
You see the world, you know the world, so how can do you love the world?
Yeah.
So the question is, do you love the world?
Uh-huh.
Well, an even more important question is how?
How? Yeah.
Or how do you love the world?
Right. Yeah. And I came back to you and I said, well, I know you, but I mostly don't know you. And I can just imagine, because I have a lot of friends who are physicians, whose lives are taken up with, touching people for the sake of healing in some way. And I watched them pretty carefully. Some of them were very dear friends to me, actually. My own physician, somebody I've known since the first day of medical school. So you think, what? He's actually your doctor? Yeah, he is, actually. And I met him, he was a 22-year-old, his first day of medical school. And I just trusted with my life, so.
I was thinking about the question about what's the more important question?
Yeah.
Can you love?
Can you love?
Or how do you love?
How do you love?
It seems to me that the second one is more important.
And I would just say, again, I was imagining something, but I was putting it into your own mind and heart a little bit, thinking,
Right.
well, what I can imagine your life has been, Doc.
Right.
It's been, well, how do I promise week by week on Sunday to love you again this week with gladness and singleness of heart, knowing that tomorrow morning I'm going to walk into my office and a woman's going to come to me and she's got a pain. She has a longing, she's got a hurt, a wound in some way. And I've studied for years of my life how to address the hurts, the longings, the pains of women. And realizing that sometimes I can prescribe this, I can do this. Other times I have to say to them tomorrow or next week, I can't do anything actually. I just don't know what to do actually. This is not a good story to tell you, because in fact there's a problem here that I can't find an address. And realizing that somehow you're going to have to be somebody who week by week, opens your heart to God, saying, again this week, oh Lord, can I walk into my office with gladness and singleness of heart to love and serve you, touching with my mind, my heart, my very hands, wounded people who come to me with hurt and ache and longing. Because it's very, very, very easy. I think maybe most of the time it's very easy to say, after a while, what I hoped I would be when I was a 22-year-old or a 28-year-old, it's just gotten too hard to, again, take up the pain of the world with my own heart. And I do this because I make my living, I make my money doing this, I can support my family doing this. Oh, Jesus, it's gotten too hard to really care for this woman again this week, because it's just too much. Yes.
So, I think the question, the rub of the question is in the area of the act of the will.
Yeah.
Like, those kinds of loves where it's like, feels like it's a choice to love. It's I know you seem unlovable, but yet I will love you. I mean, because there's that other kind of love, the story of love that just
This
is.
story is completely from
Yeah, which means that familial love, I always call it the love that just is. The love that has no good explanation, just is there. Like when your teenager is terrible, your teenage child, you cannot deny the fact that just absolutely gorgeous creature that is. And vice versa, this terrible ogre of a father yet I still love it, it just is the hope that all loves kind of transform into that kind of love that just happens quite apart from reason, will, and effort. Just kind of merge.
It's a very good question, Steve, and in one sense, it's a mystery to me how it all works out. In my shelf in our living room, I have about these many books prominently displayed that are all hardbacks of C.S. Lewis's writings. You know, I'm not a tax attorney. I always tell my kids, no, I'm not a tax attorney. We can't afford to do that probably. You know, but I have, as a professor, sorted out over time, visited youth bookstores in many places of the world, and I found, there this book is, you know. And I have these many copies of many of the first editions of C.S. Lewis's work. I've kind of found a way to buy this one, buy this one, buy this one, and they're prized to me. So I'm a pretty close reader of C.S. Lewis's work. I call myself a mere Christian, even as I call myself an Anglican. I see myself in a theological tradition. Richard Baxter, the Anglican, was the person who actually initiated the language of mere Christian. So, and Lewis picked it up a few centuries later. So I'm that person. I'm not persuaded of the four loves, though, of Lewis's argument. I mean, I wouldn't say, oh, you're wrong, but I think in some ways it's hard for me to go along with where you see there's this, and this, really. I don't think he does very well with the word eros, for example. But I just can't see it used in the New Testament in a way which seems reductive. Seems to be something skewed about eros that I can't see distinguished as he does in the book. But, so Storge and I think I like Augustine's ordinary loves better. It's a way to understand how we make sense of the loves of our hearts, getting the loves ordered rightly. My dear wife is here. I'll say maybe tomorrow morning about how you want in the address and sermon. But for a long time, I have loved her kisses. They're not salvific, though. They don't save me from my sin. I prize them. Yes, I do prize them, actually. But they can't be the most important thing in my life either. They can't be sort of like placed up here, because that's a disordering of my loves. You know, she gets the loves in the wrong place, the wrong way. I love Earl Grey tea in the morning. This is my second cup today, on the table here. In some ways, you could say Stephen Garber lives for Earl Grey in the morning. do I get well in the morning by doing this? That's sort of the way it sort of carries me into the morning and the day and every day of my life. You know, I carry Earl Grey tea bags with me wherever I go in the world. A little packet here in my backpack, because I want to make sure I have access to Earl Grey again this day. It isn't salvific, though. It save me from my sin. I can't say the most important thing in the world is Earl Grey tea. How does it compare with my wife's kisses? I don't think about it that way. They are affections, as Augustine talked about. It's the ordering of my affections. It's ordering of my desires, my longings, my loves. My children, we have 5 kids, and Quentin and I were talking about a few minutes ago about the love of teenagers and how do you keep doing that, because those are hard years for parents most of the time. If you get them through teenage years, you think, I describe my life. People say, how you doing, Steve? How your kids doing? I have for years, without a blink, said, I wake in the morning with my children in my throat. Because I just do. I wake up in the morning, one of the very first thoughts every day is, how my kids doing? Or I know how they are doing or aren't doing day by day. And I wake with my children in my throat day by day. Why? Their lives are complicated. The older they get, whether they be less complicated, they're more complicated. Their own hopes, dreams, aches, pains, hope, longings, loves get more complex the older they get, which isn't surprising now that I'm this age rather than being a 25-year-old new father. It seemed that those years, innocent as I was and they were, if I get them out of diapers, well, that would be okay. That would be a pretty good moment in my life, won't it? I had no idea how complicated we could actually get out of diapers. And so I do love, but there's ache and there's complexity and longing in my heart as a father. The older I get, the older they get. Do I love them? Yes, I love them. But I wake in the morning with my children in my throat.
I guess what I was asking was,
I'm sorry.
The rub of the, no, it's great, that's all excellent stuff, but the rub of the question is, if we know it, will we love it?
Yeah.
And the implication in that question is, well, perhaps not.
Yeah.
And yet there are these other instances where it just happens without willpower or decision or anything like that. And I'm just wondering if the questions, the shift is, that's what, by God's grace, because He loves with an everlasting love, granted He has will and He chooses to come
Yeah.
and take on flesh.
Which is why I said last night about, quoting Dr. Packer, on that chapter, Knowing and Being Known, in the very last paragraph. This is the remarkable thing, brothers and sisters, that God knows the worst about us and chooses to love us. And that we can't surprise Him with ourselves. And we're so often disillusioned about ourselves, and as Packer says, and Christ's determination to bless us. Because He knew the worst about us, but He chose to love us. And that's such a surprising way to understand the world. Because I would say, most of the time, most of us would say, no, in fact, the more I know, the harder it is to love. I didn't used to know. But now that I know, I've been in Washington, D.C. for a long time now. People come every year with the COVID fever in their hearts. Imagine if I just get across that river and get into Washington, D.C., I'll change the world after it. I'm serious, I'm gifted, I'm earnest, I'm smart, I'll work hard. And then is it 6 months later, 2 years later, to think, this is a hard place to be. You can't do like that, actually. I used to imagine when I lived in Iowa City, if I got to Washington, I'd change the world, wouldn't I? Because I knew how to be in the world. I had no idea how this was a sausage being made city. Ugly, it's messy, actually. And the big question which I wrestled with for most of my life is, how would you stick with a vocation to the public life of America and the world? Know what you now know. Could you do that? Or are you going to become a cynic too? Deciding to stay, become a, put a pejorative term to it, become a lobbyist, and just say, it's about me. I'll get here and get mine in 25 years and go out and buy a house in Nantucket and be happy the rest of my life. Or will you stay here and try to work out a vocation in public square, knowing what I now know, how hard it's going to be? That's hard to do, actually. Difficult to do. So in the public square questions, it's hard to do, just like it is in a certain sense. I give wedding homilies often in my life. I'm not a pastor like you are, but I've, alongside a pastoral person, been asked to muse over the meaning of marriage, for a young couple. And the pastor then does all the official, marrying things, and I stand beside the pastor, sort of asked by the young couple, would you talk about the meaning of marriage as we get married today? I tried so hard actually to embed myself in that couple's life in a particular place they're getting married. The mountains of Colorado, beautiful West Coast, refines of, North Carolina, places in between. Trying to think about where I am and who they are. And I try to make it be very unique, each homily. But my wife says the same thing again. How today, Steve? I said, no, I'm really different. She said, no, you said the same thing. I said, and the same thing as she has sobered me is, I've asked them after kind of glorying in the beauty of the day, the beauty of the flowers, the wonder it is of family and friends gathering around. I tried to be honestly glorying with them in their glory. But to ask them the question, okay, but now that you're here, making promises with your heart of all hearts, to know each other and to love each other for the rest of your life. It'll be hard for you. You up for that? Because it won't always be like this, you see. I never want to be a Apollo glove for them. I don't want to be that tall. But in some ways I want to say, these words you're promising today are going to cost you. They're going to be costly for you. And it will cost you your heart. In some ways, the more you know of each other over time, the harder it's going to get, actually. Are you making promises like that today? Knowing that the more you know of each other, the harder it's going to be. By God's grace, we bless you today as your community of family and friends. But you just need to know that this is going to be a hard road to love like this, to know like this, to love like this. I thought about this reading this great story, which we'll talk a little bit more about this morning. Because if you know the story of Leo here, this young boy who grows up in Charleston, he's talking to his psychiatrist in his probationary period of life. It was, some football star, this little 15-year-old puts a bag of cocaine in his pocket at a party, and all of a sudden he's the one who gets blamed for the cocaine. Goes before the judge and the court and probation, and everybody in town knows that Leo is charged with having a half pound of cocaine in his pocket. So it's wrong, but he suffers the pain and the consequence of that. But the psychiatrist, at the end of his probationary time, is reflecting back on the healing that's come to Leo's life, and he says these words: "I've never seen a father love a boy like yours loves you, Leo," she said. "I've never seen a father love a boy like yours loves you, Leo." In some ways, Pete, it's what they're talking about. It's just there. How do you explain a father's love for a child? It's hard to get it all out right. Kind of just sort it out, like where is it, and where's it come from, and what I do with the ache in my throat every morning of my life. I don't call it into being every day. It's just there. Because I long for my children day by day. And in some ways, what that Conway captures so beautifully is that here in the midst of this pain of suicide of a son, traumatized the whole family. One son left, Leo, who goes through his own wounds and pains over the next years of his life. And the psychiatrist says, watching you, Leo, watching your family as I have over these last several years, I've been court appointed to talk to you through these hard years of your life. When we first met you, you first came to see me, you can see the love that I never, ever have seen a father love a son like yours much. It's a pretty big word. It's a good question. Yes?
One thing I've been thinking about, beyond the last 24 hours, but it's kind of really comes to a point, is, we certainly have knowledge now that no other humans in history have had. The access to the internet is completely transformed the things we can know about.
Exactly.
And I guess I'm curious, do you find that there's a or an inverse correlation between the amount of knowledge that we consume or engage with and our ability to love? It seems to me that it seems that the amount of knowledge can at times become paralyzing for our ability to love, and particularly our knowledge of things away, far away, that we have no agency over, no ability to love, and keeps us from being able to love what's present.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, a generation, I don't know, probably several hundred years ago, Lord Byron, the British poet, has a long poem reflecting on the fall out of Genesis 3. Yeah, it's beautifully, eloquently sort of reflecting, as a poet might, on what actually the fall was about. And contrary to the evil one, the tempter himself, who basically promises Mother Eve, Father Adam, the more you know, the better it's going to be. And Byron says, no, actually, the one who knows the most mourns the deepest. I've often reflected on this question because of what I worked at picked up in life, on how the poets get there first, or the artists get there first. Isn't it in some ways they're best gifted, but in some ways they're aesthetically sensitive to what's going on in the world the way that most of the rest of us are. They feel things first. So I've often argued that if you really want to understand what's going on in a moment of history, listen to the artist, because they touch things first. It's kind of like the antennae of a bug, kind of crudely put. They're just out there feeling things first. So, for example, you'll hear a bit more this morning about why I have long loved bamboo too. Years ago, there used to be an MTV in the world, which we don't really even imagine. But there used to be a time called MTV. You could watch almost any song, and they were really different artists. There used to be an MTV version of the best music. was a song called Numb some years ago, which U2 had done. And the MTV version, which you go onto YouTube this afternoon and say, Numb, what does it really look like? I'll describe it in a moment here. But it's in the Edge, who's a sort of strangely named, big guitar player for the band, always with a knit cap on his head. But the very first moments of the MTV version are of a faucet dripping, 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 dripping. And all of a sudden, the camera changes, and you see the dripping onto the head, the forehead of the Edge. He sits up, and then for the next 2 or 3 minutes, he's just looking straight at you, it appears to be. And he just, he says, and that people, a little girl comes and offers him a dollop of ice cream. A big girl comes and kisses him on his cheek. Somebody comes behind him and puts a rope around his neck, and on, these different kind of moments that people experience in this world. Wonderful things, not so wonderful things, actually. He just stares ahead, though, and you're not quite figuring out, is he looking at me or what? Look at the screen. And all of a sudden, Bon and the rest of the band begin to come around and sing, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb, I feel numb. Too much is not enough, I feel numb. Think about the words, brothers and sisters. Too much is not enough. And if you watch the video carefully enough, you realize he's not looking at me, he's actually looking at this TV screen, which you never see on the MTV version of the song. But you realize that metaphorically, the Edge is sort of giving us a window into what it looks like to be alive in the modern world, to be screen mediated in life, whether it's going to be a TV screen or it's my computer screen, when I can know so much about everything all over the universe, take it all in 24/7. And how do you know so much and still care about it? Like Lord Byron said a long time ago. In fact, dear people, the one who knows the most warns the deepest. Why? Because it's hard to take in. I know you, but I don't know you, Doc. What I said to you, imagine a little bit of the life I've imagined you might have had in life. How would you walk into your office one more week knowing you're going to take the pain of the world into your heart? Thoughtful, serious, gifted by God as you have been, and take the pain of the world into your heart week by week. I just imagine that there's a certain discipline of the heart to say, I will care again this week. I'll care for you again this week. New as it is to me, complicated as it will be for me, I won't end the day thinking it was just a job, just my job. But how would you walk in with a sense of calling from God to take the pain of the world into your heart again this week?
To solve a problem. My wife says, I just want you to listen to me. Solve it.
I was telling Sarah, physical therapist, that in the room. I have a friend who's a Mayo Clinic physician, psychiatrist by training, and I was speaking on these things a few years ago in Rochester, Minnesota. And he went to me afterwards and said, hearing you today, so I think about my own vocation as a doc here at the clinic. He says, I'm a psychiatrist by training, so that's what I've been doing for years and years. But I walk into the patients' rooms who want to see me or I've been assigned to talk to. And after a few minutes, I'll have to hear the person say, but I don't want to see a doc over there. I don't want to see a chaplain. And he said, I am a doctor. And the person said, well, why are you asking these questions then? Aren't these the questions the chaplain would ask? He says, no, I actually see you as a more complex person with heart and mind, soul and strength. I'm not just asking about your body, the chemical, biological functions. I'm asking about who you are. And the physician, the patient would say, but why would the doctor ask those questions?
Médecin de la personne.
Say it again.
Médecin de la personne. The whole person.
The whole person, exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'm just thinking about the work of a physician, or the work of medical, physical help in all kinds of different ways. To address the whole person is a more costly calling. Because in some ways, the medical schools, the healthcare training over the years we learn in the materialist society that we live in, are less and less willing to say we are whole people. It's harder to think that way. Good question, Patrick. Anybody else?
It seems to me that the question itself is very easy to answer as long as the thing that you know aligns with what you love. That if what you come to know is different than that which you love, you want to answer no, which I think it's to Augustine's questions around reordering your love. That the moment you find that what you know is hard to love, it means your loves are disordered,
I think so.
is kind of where I walk away. And I was thinking similarly to kind of what Patrick's question was, that love is also pointless without proximity. That like we can't actually love anything if we aren't close to it. And in fact, when we are close to it, though that it's difficult at times, it's actually the only way to love, right? Like I think about, it's really easy to hate your neighbor until you talk to them, right? Because you still might be annoyed that they do these things, bamboo shoots in the yard or whatever. But the fact that you have built some kind of relational capital with them, I think it causes us to have grace. Whereas, I don't know, I think about social media, it's really easy to argue with someone on social media and call them dumb and whatever, because you don't ever have to deal with them, right? Like hate is born out of the void of distance.
That's exactly right. That's exactly.
And so it begs the question of like, if I want to know and love the world, I have to be close to it in such a way that
You want to go for a long walk and talk about these things? That's exactly right, Ellen. In fact, this morning, I'm going to finish before we all walk off for lunch with the proximate, which actually is a very good word, and I'll tell you why later today. It's actually the first use of it that I've been able to figure out, like Augustine. He uses it as thinking through the ordering of our loves, this Latin language of delectio proximi, which is the love of what's closest. The love of neighbor, the love of what's closest to me. And actually trying to make sense of how do you figure out the ordering of your loves? Well, there has to be an account for what it is you live with day by day. What's nearest to you, what is neighbor to you, in your life, which you understand most fully, most closely. So you might have thought it was just metaphorical, my neighbor's bamboo. No, it's not actually, I talked about it because I know that story. We live in a very multicultural street actually. There's this neighbor from India, this neighbor from Guatemala, this neighbor from Korea, this neighbor from la 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 along the street. And got several Asians that mixed toward us over the years. And, this is a Korean family. And mother, father don't speak much English, but they have an industrious, flourishing life in some kind of ways. A lot of Koreans live in our part of the village. Well, bamboo looks okay for a distance. So there's two different kinds you can plant. The one just stays where you planted it. The other kind just is insidious, because it just grows everywhere, because it grows underground. In Northern Virginia, it's called invasive plant now, which is against the law to plant. Well, some years ago, somebody said, I like bamboo. They planted the invasive species, actually. So what happens over time? His bamboo becomes my bamboo. And my fence doesn't stop it, actually, because it just grows underground. I got angry after that. I kept thinking, I can cut it down, I can dig it out, but what happens 3 weeks later? There's just more bamboo coming up, And I just kept thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? About a year and a half ago, I guess, in the spring, I saw it outside early this spring, and I said, I just wondered, what about your bamboo? Because my bamboo now, too. Didn't speak very, articulate English, but a good man, I think interesting. And his son became kind of a friend to me over time. He said, yes, I don't like it either. And I thought he was going to do something about it, that summer. He didn't. And I said, well, what am I going to do about it? I can't stop it. And he wants to stop it. Well, this spring he came over to me and he said, I'm going to bring somebody in to dig it all out. And I thought, okay, great. And I said, we'll help you pay for it. And he brought a crew in to dig and furrow and everything. It looked okay for 2 or 3 weeks until it come up again. I would dig it out again with my big deep thing, and I would spray weed killer inside the hole, hoping I would put it to death. And end of the summer, you know what it is again? It's all up again. And I don't know what to do to stop it. So how do I know my neighbor is to love my neighbor? It's a very real question. Because I love to grow things. I planted probably 15, 20 dogwoods in our yard over the years. I love to grow. We have azaleas and rhododendrons and all kinds of perennials, black-eyed Susans come up, you know, hospitals of all kinds, all throughout the summer perennials. I love to do these things. I care a lot about that. So it isn't a bit different how things are. I care deeply about those things. So it weighs upon me to watch his family become my neighbor. I can't stop it. So you're right, you know, it's what's closest to you. We're in some ways cautious. It's in some ways, people say, what do you mean by this, Steve? This hypocrisy of character. I said, just like again about being man. You can do life, no, you would still have it. And immediately everyone says to me, oh, I see what you're saying. Because they realize how frail we are and how hard that is to really know and to be around.
But it's also the beauty of the thing, right? That, because it also tells us that if you have to be proximate to another person who really loves them, it tells you that God has to be closer.
That's why those words of Dr. Packer are so deep for me. He knew the worst about it, which is he's not surprised by his mistakes. Yeah, you're right. That's exactly right. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
When you were talking about meeting with the group, I was asking, like, can you suffer and live in a very, like, much smaller sense? It reminded me of the conversation I had with my dad in the spring. I went through, like, my first really intense breakup, and I was processing it with him. And I was like, I would do it all again, like, it was a great experience, it was worth it. But even the best parts were taxing. I mean, like, being in love and all those things, I was like, even that was like hard and made me go really slow in my life and took me away from things that I cared about. And I just looked at it and was like, this marriage and family thing, I was like, is it worth it?
Is it worth it?
And he said, that's the wrong question. He's like, that's not, he's like, try to think of another question to approach it with. And I'm still working on that, but it was totally different. It
I
wasn't.
think I like your dad. You should too.
He's a good one. Anyways, that's what it reminded me of. It brought to mind was me asking him that, like,
Yeah.
how is this worth it?
Did you see what a remarkable, to use John Newton's language, what an amazing grace it is to know that we can be known and loved at the same time. It's profound, satisfying, it's maybe the deepest of all pleasures, and to realize that I can be known and still be loved. Ah. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that found connection. It's poetic, beautiful, but it's surprising that to be a grace like that. Amazing as it is. Thank you. Dad's good man.
Yeah.
Well, should we get going here and then press in? Okay. So here we are, Visions of Vocation one more time. So I mentioned Jack Packer last night and this morning in the Anglican Pantheon. One of my other great teachers in life is a man named John Stott, who died a few years ago. I remember having lunch with him one day in this little flat in London, and one of the greatest moments in my life, and some of those conversations you just cannot forget and should not forget in life. We were sitting together in this little humble flat out on an alleyway in the center of London. And here's the Protestant Pope himself, looking down an alleyway. You think, how very glorious, wasn't a beautiful kind of plotted land in Charleston, South Carolina, a little alleyway in the middle of London. Thinking, you live here, Uncle John? No, he did, had a simple lunch with him. He said these words to me. He said, Stephen, he said, I've never ever given a lecture in my life, preached a sermon, written a book, ran by afterwards. It wasn't quite what I wanted it to be. I thought to myself quietly, you think that, John Stott? I can live my life now. Never a lecture, a sermon, a book. I didn't think afterwards. It wasn't quite what I wanted it to be. If you can sigh like that, you can regret like that, you can wish differently. Well, I can live my life too. Well, one of the many gifts that John taught to me, one was hearing his Oxbridgian, ways over the course of many years, hearing again and again saying, biblical exegete that he was. When Jesus says to the disciples, those who gathered together, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "You are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world." And Uncle John put it this way: these are affective commodities. Affective commodities. You see, they affect their environments. So he says, why would you blame the world for being the world? Why would you walk into a room and blame the room for being dark? Why wouldn't you ask and say, why wasn't the light turned on? How would you come across rotting meat and say, meat curse you for rotting? Why did you rot? Why wouldn't you ask the question and say, why wasn't this meat salted? So John Stott puts it like this. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. They affect their environments. Why would you blame the world for being the world? Some of my closest friends in Washington and beyond have been listening to these kind of ideas for a long time. And we decided probably 15 years ago, a series of maybe year-long phone conversations before Zoom ever imagined itself into being. We just get on the phone about once a month and just talk about that question. How do we somehow care about the world, complex as it is? It's easy to imagine when you vote year by year and every 4 years, you just get the right guys into Washington, wouldn't we just save the world, actually? It doesn't really work that way, even though that matters to us, our well-being. It doesn't work that way, because you know why? Because the reality is, dear people, that the culture is upstream from politics. The culture is upstream from politics. What happens in Charleston, Des Moines, Denver, LA, Shreveport, Boise, you see, the culture is upstream from politics. What happens in Washington, whether we like it or not, almost always happened in Boise first, in Bakersfield first, in Visalia first, in Covington, Louisiana first, and Denver first, and Minneapolis first. And if it blows hard enough, long enough, which is why, in fact, there are lobbyists who represent all kinds of small and large interests from all over America on K Street in Washington, D.C. Why? Because somebody wants to represent the high school principals of America. Their vote, their influence, their lobbies. Why is it that every wheat grower in America belongs to some kind of a group that says, I'll put in my $100 this year because I want the wheat growers in America to be represented in the debate? Why does AT&T and Apple weigh in so heavily with such money to affect what? Legislation, affecting what? Their corporate interests. Blessing or curse, dear people, that's the way it works. The culture is upstream from politics. Realizing that to be true, we weren't saying politics doesn't matter, but in some way we're trying to understand its historical meaning too, its actual cultural meaning too. And after about a year of discussion about these things, these political strategists, my neighbor in Washington, D.C., me, the professor always at the table, a businessman in Kansas City, a national producer of the best music in America, an artist in New York City, a painter, deciding, in fact, we would create a group we called the Wedgwood Circle. The Wedgwood Circle, named after a businessman in 1700s in England, Josiah Wedgwood. And when William Wilberforce, member of the Parliament, and after 10 years of initiating legislation to abolish slavery in the United Kingdom, getting laughed out of the Parliament year after year. Why? Because at that time in history, the slave trade was the heart of the economy for the British Empire. You couldn't have slaves on British soil. It's the irony, of course. But they could export them to the world. It became the centerpiece of the British economy for a long time. Of course, Charleston has its own place in that story. The Wilberforce was laughed out of the Parliament for 10 years, every year. We're never, ever, ever going to address that question here in London. They realized that they were not going to do it that way, politically first. And they began to talk through together, and what would it mean to try to address the deeper reality of the culture upstream from politics. They created, a society that began to spawn societies, they call them, that addressed child labor questions, and education questions, and agricultural reform question, Bible distribution question. 60 societies they created over the next 30 years, trying to address the culture and upstream of politics reality. And one of those who participated in that discussion was Josiah Wedgwood, whose family owned Wedgwood China. And he decided, he said, well, I can't do this or this because I can't do that, but I can commission a plate, Wedgwood blue plate as it is. And have a slave in chains as a cameo on it. And have the words over the top, am I not a man and also a brother? And he sold them. They were not philanthropy. It would be so beautiful, he said, people will buy this actually. And they did. It wasn't the sole answer to the question. It was a part of the answer to the question of over 30 years in the British world, the British Parliament finally after 30 years of push, shove, said no more in the United Kingdom. Whether we like it or not, history's complicated, of course it is, isn't it? Always is. But if we hadn't had a Revolutionary War in America, we would have still been part of the United Kingdom at the time of the Fort Sumter, and beyond that, and Francis Marion, and we would have been a different kind of people. We would have, in early 1820s, would have no longer had slavery as a problem in America. Wouldn't have been possible anymore. Complicated history. I'm not saying it's easy and simple, but it's part of the reality of history, actually. Josiah Wedgwood contributed his plate. We call ourselves the Wedgwood Circle for that reason. And the idea was to bring together people who were financiers with financial ability, and those who were artists, who were painters in New York City, and playwrights in New York City, who were musicians from Nashville, and filmmakers from Los Angeles, into the same room, a room like this all over in the Nashville, LA's, and New York City of the world, and say, let's think together about what it would look like to care about the culture. Not to say, blame the world for being in the world. What would it look like if we entered in as salt and light to history? To step in and say, well, what if we actually told different stories? Could we do that? Could we make different kinds of stories that people would want to hear? Early on in this process, I was in Nashville for a weekend with some good friends who were committed to the same proposition, a poet from London, a musician, a producer, musicians in Nashville. And I was asked to be part of it for a few days with about 50 young musicians. You can imagine this is the way it really works. It does work this way. Here are these 15-year-olds essentially who aspire to, becoming virtuosos, this and this. In the same room for a few days. And I asked this question at that gathering in those days. Can you sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe in language the whole world knows? You see, it's one thing to say, well, I'm a Christian. I can make a Christian song. And who will sing it? Well, other Christians, of course. Maybe. Or they might think, it's just a Christian song, isn't it? I'm going to sing that. That's poorly done. I know Christian music, don't I? I passed that way on my radio station very quickly because it's not very good music, actually. Or it might be you just think, well, of course, it'll glorify God. Sola Deo Gloria. Here's Johann Sebastian Bach here, transcription. But you see, Bach not only did SDG to the St. Matthew's Passion, but to the violin concerto. All his music was to the glory of God alone. He didn't have that suffer from the dualism we have, thinking, well, this is a Christian song, this is a secular song, this is sacred music, this is secular music. He didn't see it dualistically like we tend to in our own life. It all was more seamless, more coherent. A sense of calling before God to serve the world with his music. SDG all day long. So my question to these young musicians was, can you learn to sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe, but in language the whole world understands? It's a harder question. Because somehow it isn't asking you to give up on what you believe, but asking the question, can you translate what you believe most deeply about everything, about life, God, and the world, into language the rest of the world can understand? Or you're only going to be able to sing songs people who think like you, believe like you, understand. Do you hear the weight of the question?
Yeah. How do you deal with the answer that people don't listen?
That was true for Jesus too, wasn't it? The very first story he told, which is good for us to hear this, isn't it? Because his first out of the block teaching was, there once was a man who threw these seeds out onto the pathways of the world. Some was like this, some this, some this, and this. If you have ears to hear, then hear. And then he just walked away. We would want Jesus to say, well, you see, I'm going to explain the story to you like this. He just says, ears to hear, then hear. And he walks away. And you have to say, but what do you mean by that, teacher? Rabbi, what do you mean by those words? And in some ways, he put it right into the faces of those who were listening to say, you have to think it through for yourself. Do you want to know what this means? Because you're responsible for what you know. To come back to that question last night. What are you going to do with what you know? It's the deepest of all questions. He put it right into the faces of his listeners and saying, but what are you going to do with this now? Do you want to know? Well, then you have to pursue it and kind of ask a deeper question. Then he says, well, you see, the story's about this, and this, and this, and this. Because you see, I would say that depending on you, Jesus is always, if you want to hear, then you have to hear. Like that ears to hear. And that probably is the deepest of all the questions. Someone's you have ears to hear, or not. But sometimes, and I will talk about U2 later on a little bit more this morning, but it amazes me to go to the U2 concerts of the world, where the scores of thousands of people come from all over the face of the earth, listen to this band play. You have to buy like scores of thousands night by night. And you think, so what do you guys do? Here are thousands of people who with you, song by song, singing their hearts out and basically saying, this is my music! Tonight I get to sing again. How long, oh Lord, do I sing this song? I think this is Psalm 40 after all. And how are people all over the world, saying, this is my music? I think, well, how did you guys do this? Making the songs of God himself. People who may or may not have any interest in the God of the scriptures think that these songs that U2 sings are their songs. That's one example of that. Well, this is the question which in some ways runs through my life, actually. It runs through my life. Because you see, whether we are musicians, playwrights, filmmakers, whatever we are, whether we are butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, all of us live in this world, whether we like it or not. A pluralizing world, a secularizing world, a globalizing world. We just do. It isn't really up for grabs. It isn't a question. We just live in this world, actually, all day long. It's the reality of your life and mine. Whether we like it, think about it, want it, it's the reality of all day long for all of us. We live in this world all day long. A secularizing world. Saying what? Increasingly, in the language of Peter Berger, we live in a world without windows, the transcendence and truth. Get over it. We're done with that sacred world, transcendent reality. It's just here and now, push and shove. I'm not going to ask about who you are as a human being when I walk into my office, because you're not a whole person, you're just a body to me. I've been trained to respond to your body, not you as a human being. It's harder to care for human beings. When a 12-year-old comes in, she or he has this ache or pain, you realize, okay, I know that you say it's this, but watching you, listen to you, I think it's actually a more complicated thing. Because you realize that contrary to the secular materialism we live in, it isn't just that you're a body, abstracted. You are more complicated. Image bearer of God that you are, full of complex aches and pains and longings and hopes. And wounds can be not only things that physically I can account for, but actually maybe more deeply, spiritually, as true as anything else in your life. So for me, pluralizing is about what? Well, even in a city like Charleston, I'm sure you can walk the streets and think, well, and you believe what? And you believe what? Even though this is a city full of spires as it is. Who live here, that people don't always very much honor up in the spires of the city. They think, well, I get along pretty well, thank you. not thinking much about the spires in my life. I may honor that there's a St. Michael's Church in town, but there's a cathedral church in town. But my life is really about the people. I don't publicly dishonor the spires of the city, but my life's pretty much different than that, actually. I get along pretty well, thank you, with me and mine. Because I believe in this instead, whether it's officially a Hindu, a Buddhist, evolutionary materialist, whether they name the name or not. People believe all kinds of things in this pluralized world about the nature of reality, about the nature of who we are and how we live in the world. That's just true, whether we like it or not. Globalizing, well, when you call United Airlines, as I do week by week, and I find, I think she's from India, isn't she? Will she understand my question or not today? You realize even United Airlines employs a call center in south of India. You just hope that she knows where Denver is. I've been to the south of India and I love that part of the world very, very much. I realize too, because I fly a lot, I'm traveling a lot, I realize too often in my mind, she may not even know where Denver is in relation to Washington, D.C. I'm thinking, oh, it's harder for me now. Globalizing means all kinds of things. But it means the fact that we live all day long in a world where we're living with people who are somehow, as you put it, Patrick, knowing more and more about it, not just about what happens in my neighborhood, but what happened, 5 minutes ago in Dakar, or in Dubai. I have to deal 5 minutes later with the bombing in London this morning. It's my bombing too. I think, what am I going to do with that all right? I can't bear that anymore. So globalizing means, of course, that we live in it isn't just my neighbors, because I realize that in some ways the neighborhoods of the world become my neighborhoods. Even though I don't see her day by day, I have to deal with that. Her reality is part of my life day by day too. And I would just say to you that all of us, consciously or not, whether we want to or not, live in this world all the time. So how are we going to translate what we believe to be true into this world? How are we going to sing songs that are the truest truths of the universe and right as the whole world understands? That's the reality, friends, right there. That's the reality. You see, the challenge of making sense of who we are, of why we are, what we do with our lives, is always in this context. Vocation is always everywhere about that. So let's step into this here. Even your own poets have said, of course, it's how Paul described walking through the Athenian marketplace. Walking through, seeing this, hearing this, thinking, and there she is over this statue to what? To an unnamed god, he says. But he's invited to speak on Mars Hill. He says, well, even your own poets have said. Doing what? Quoting the poets of Athens, please. So, Pat Conroy, how about Pat Conroy? One of your own poets, maybe the poet laureate, at least the novelist laureate of South Carolina. Is that fair? Is there anybody else who represents the novelist laureate of South Carolina? Maybe there is, I don't think so, but that's my best shot at it. I first read Lords of Discipline, almost 40 years ago, I suppose. I was surprised being in California and in Colorado when I was never really walking the streets of Charleston, thinking, I think I can smell Charleston walking along the streets of Charleston with Pat Conroy, thinking, you're very good, this whoever you are, Pat Conroy. Because I can actually not only see the flowers, smell their fragrance, I feel like I'm walking the streets. This story of the Citadel, undergraduate life, growing up, push and shove of being a 20-year-old, and all that happens in that story of Citadel life in this young man in this time and place. Feeling like, whoever you are, Pat Conroy, you have a remarkable gift to draw me into the world which is yours. I feel like I know something more about Charleston because I've been reading your story. I read The Water is Wide, along the way. It was life on Defisky, Island. He was a school teacher for the year. Became a film called Conrad over time. And here I have, South of Broad right here, which begins with these remarkable words. It was my father who called the city the mansion on the river. He was talking about Charleston, South Carolina. And he was the native son, Peacock proud of a town so pretty makes your eyes ache with pleasure just to walk down its spellbinding narrow streets. I'm Charleston born and bred. The city's two rivers, the Ashley and the Cooper, have flooded and shaped all the days of my life on this storied peninsula. I carry the porcelain beauty of Charleston like the hinged shell of some soft-tissued mollusk. My soul is peninsula-shaped and sun-hardened and river-swollen. The high tides of the city flood my consciousness each day, subject to the whims and harmonies of full moons rising out of the Atlantic. I grow calm when I see the ranks of palmetto trees pulling guard duty on the banks of Colonial Lake, or hearing the bells of St. Michael's calling cadence on the cicada-filled trees along Meeting Street. Those are the first words, aren't they? And if you just read, as I read, through these pages of this story, south of Broad, dear people, where you live, this neighborhood here after all, you think, Pat Conner, you're pretty good with words, actually. Some of these words, I think, these sentences, I think, that was so beautiful, and you captured this so well. But not only smells of the flowers, not only the scent of the ocean and the combination of ocean waters and rivers flowing into the ocean and push and shove of water like that in the nostrils of your life and mine. It gets us pretty well. The river swollen and the palmettos and the full moons and all of that, really. I love the language of this storied peninsula as it is. My soul's peninsula shaped, sun-hardened, river swollen. I mean, that's only 2 paragraphs. But if you were just to walk through it, you think, you get this pretty well. You get it pretty well. So I have to ask questions about Pat Conroy. Don't see, though he references, God sometimes in his writing. Sometimes there's a God-hauntedness in his writing. In fact, in an interview with him later in his life, he put it like this. He began to see the question of faith as meaningful for him. And he was to argue that the best literature, he said, quote, is always God-haunted. That questions about God, his being and his nature, his character, should be written into a good book, he argued. And intriguingly, late in his life, he was drawn into the literary richness of the Inklings, of Lewis and Tolkien and their friends, wishing that he had something like that, but he didn't. So he was very good as a writer, giving us the experience of walking down the sidewalks of South Carolina, seeing and hearing and even smelling more than we could ever have imagined. I enjoy reading his sentences, the very way he composes his words and ideas, creating a literary world that makes me feel that I'm more than ever that I would have. God haunted, though. But for those of us, those who are the companions of my heart and my mind, whose intellectual depth and range was born of honest faith, honest hope, honest love. I lived my life among other Southern novelists too, ones who bring more philosophical and theological richness to their writing. A long reader of those who chronicle the life and times of the American South, who in their own artful ways argue that while the South is the South, it's also a window into the wider world, as distinctive and unique as it is in the history of societies and cultures. The readers I read most carefully offer its socially formed vision of life under the sun, as reflective of what it feels like to be alive for everyone everywhere, for every man and for every woman, for every son of Adam, every daughter of Eve. So, ones I read most carefully are these two, actually, Walker Percy and Wendell Berry. They are exemplars to me, as storytellers of the highest order, novelists whose work goes very far, very wide. They are known by everyone everywhere because their books reflect a true knowledge of our loves and longings, our joys and our sorrows. As far as their characters are from us, the worlds of New Orleans, New York City, of rural Kentucky, we see ourselves with uncanny insight as we live in and through people who populate these novels. And both Barry and Percy are folk who believe what we believe about the Trinity, about a Trinitarian universe, about God and sin and salvation, about the truth of the human condition, about the nature of hope, history, and hope. But you see, both these men, both these stories, both these artists are people who learn to sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe in language the whole world can understand. Yet Conroy is very gifted, very good. In some ways, he was always on this side as I read his work, read his interpreters, read his own words, beginning to wonder in his life about, well, what about this? And is a good book possible if this represents something that's God haunted? I don't think so, probably. But never did he fully enter in from what I can read to, yes, I believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Never did he step into completely the life of the world of the Inklings. I was intrigued by that possibility and began to hope against hope that maybe I could find people who would write like I want to write and nourish me in my writing. He somehow, from what I can see, didn't quite enter in the end. Though I don't know. God alone knows that. These two, on the other hand, you read Barry's poetry, for example, you think, you believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, don't you? He doesn't name Jesus in every page of his essays or his novels. But you're pretty clear, all said and done. You believe in the same world I do, actually, don't you? But you pretend to be somebody who, those who read it most carefully, read literature most carefully, is called the most prophetic voice in America today. Interesting description, isn't it? Of somebody who's a Trinitarian Christian, who takes faith, hope, and love very seriously. The most prophetic voice in America today? Here's Walker Percy in the New York Literati. When they discovered him years ago with his first novel, The Moviegoer. Said, finally an American Camus. He said, no, you missed me, actually. That, he said, I look at the starkness of the human soul right clear in the eye. I look at that carefully. You're right about that. When he won the National Book Award for Fiction, that novel. But he said, you missed me if you think I'm just Camus, who is seeing the sorrow of the world and thinking, despair, despair, despair. He says, there's always a hint of hope in my body. A hint of hope. And dear South Carolinians that you are, what is it? How you describe yourselves? While I breathe, I hope. So here's Walker Percy who says, no, you missed me if you don't hear the hint of hope in my writing. He's not naming the Trinity every page of his writings. But you begin to listen carefully, you realize the fact that he's not just God haunted, but in fact he realizes the fact that the deepest truths of the universe have to be woven into the work of his heart and his life. As he does what? Wins the American Book Award for Fiction. As he's named by the New York Literati as, our most serious writer today. I think so, and you believe what? You'd find your way into a church like this one, where the confession is, I believe in the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And somehow you learn to do what? I've learned actually to sing the songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe in language the whole world can understand. That's an unusual gift, isn't it? It's an unusual gift. See, for me, the question for all of us today would be this one. Can we become as theologically mature as we are professionally competent? Too often we imagine that those who are theologically serious is the pure goal in that corner, and those of us who are professionally competent go out in this corner. You imagine that somehow in actually the work of my life, imagining the underground, pipes and wires running through the belly of the city, are done somehow by somebody who actually thinks through the question of the flourishing of the city of Charleston, and does so because of theologically born reasons, biblically rooted reasons. I realize that this is not just my job, it is just the work of my days. Actually, I'm contributing under the work of God himself to the flourishing of my city. That's why it matters that I build this stuff, infrastructure, with great care and integrity. Because I realize this is not only for me and the job today, it's for the next generations to come. I realize that because that's how I think about the world. It's God's work. Sola Deo Gloria. And I realize that actually the work that I do matters to history because it matters to God. You see, how is it we become as theologically mature as we're professionally competent? How is it my friend, the doctor at our clinic, could walk into the rooms of his patients and have the patient say, I don't want to see a chaplain today, doctor. He says, I'm actually a psychiatrist on the staff. I'm one of the docs here at the clinic. He said, you are? But you're asking questions that only a chaplain would ask, wouldn't they? He said, well, I'm asking a question that a good doctor would ask. It isn't, I think that I'm a materialist and you are too. You're just the body. You're actually more complicated. Heart, mind, soul, and strength. And my questions are going to actually be about who are you then? How are you, capital Y, doing? How are you doing today? Because I learned to actually see you as an image bearer of God, full, as I said last night, of both glory and ruin. And that's why you're here, aren't you? In the clinic this day, this week. Because you're complicated. Glory and ruin. If I'm going to be a physician for you, you have to address both the glory and the ruin of your life. You see, it's as being serious about faith as we are as being serious about life. There's no final distinction between the two. Some years ago, I was teaching a summer school course at Regent College in British Columbia. It was on the Visions of Vocation book, actually. People from all over the world would come for the week of the class, from here and here and here and there. And the last morning of the class, last Friday morning, a woman from Sydney, Australia, who was there for the summer, walked up to me and she said, can I talk to you today before we're all done? I said, sure. So at the break in the morning, she said, well, I just wanted to say something to you. She said, I came into this week, so I've been coming to Regent College for 30 years every summer. They were in a position to do that economically and desire-wise, and I came every summer for a week or two of classes. And she said, I've been here for 30 years, but I wrestled with the question for years in my life, I never had a good answer for it. She said, I can never figure out the relation between my Christian life and my life. I asked this friend, and I kept thinking, that doesn't make sense to me. She said, I think you've answered that question this week. I said, well, I have. She said, I didn't use those. She said, yeah, you have. I said, well, what is the relation? She said, they're the same thing, aren't they? I said, you're right. They're the same thing. You see, we stumble over dualism all day long. We're disposed to dualism in this world. And for years of her life, she just was thinking, well, my Christian life, you see, is about this. I want to talk about things that are really of the Spirit for me, or the things that are most important to me. That's part of my Christian life. Then I get on with my regular life, of course, because that's over here, isn't it? She said, what you're saying is the fact that those are the same thing, aren't you? I said, yep, that's what I'm saying, actually. You see, these are good words, dear people, worth taking to heart. What will they mean for us to become as theologically mature as we are professionally competent? See, for you, for me, it's an invitation to seriously wrestle with who God is, with who we are, with what history is about. Hear it again, with who God is, with who we are, what history is about. Those three questions run their way through every life, and importantly here, to everyone who wants to be theologically mature, who longs to know more, to love more, to be more. In the image of God we are, called to be holy as God is holy, called into the imitation of Christ as we are the very center of our lives, of all that we are, all that we ought to be. You see, it's taking Scripture seriously, which is what in part means taking those who are our best teachers seriously. It's the Augustinian framing of the Bible and the world, isn't it? So for 1,500 years, the church has had Augustine's mind about this written through our history as the church in the world. He was the first person to read the Bible from beginning to end and say, you see, it's really a story with 4 chapters. In Latin, he put it this way. None of us are Latin scholars, and I'm not either. But he called the first chapter Posse Peccari, Posse Peccari. In Latin, able to sin, able not to sin. The second chapter, he said, non posse, non peccari. Not able, not to sin. The third chapter, imagine it a little bit with me here. Posse, non peccari. Able, not to sin. The fourth chapter, non posse, peccari. Not able to sin. What's he doing? He's doing theological anthropology here. All of us do that, consciously or not. We make some sense of who we are and how we live in the world. And for Augustine, it was this framing of the whole story of creation, of Scripture, and saying, you see, there are 4 great chapters. And they're the chapters which we could sum up with these words: ought, is, can, and will. That God made a world that ought to be, Genesis 1 and 2. The world that is, oh, God in heaven, it's wounded now. It's been cursed now. It's been ruined now. It's been bent now. Oh, Jesus, it bears upon my heart all day long. I don't know if I can live it anymore. It's so bent, really. I'm so bent. Can Christ has come in history to make all things be new? You see, it doesn't have to be that way. It could be different, couldn't it? It could be different, couldn't it? Will someday, oh Jesus, someday, to Tolkien's best language, every sad thing will come to true. Every sad thing will finally come to true. They will be as they ought to be. But in fact, fully developed, fully embodied, fully incarnate, as it ought to be, as it was meant to be, as it someday will be. You see, that's the Augustinian framing of the whole story. Leslie Newbigin, one of my great teachers, Brit as he was, goes off to India in his mid-20s with his family. Spends 40 years there, becoming part of what he called the Church of South India. Remarkable, really wonderfully good man, actually, in his life. But he wrote a book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. I can talk to him to you for hours today. I'm going to cut to the chase or just quoting one place, a book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society. Some of you know Alden Hathaway, who lives in Beaufort, I think, these days, the former bishop of that diocese of Pittsburgh. He and I were very close friends many years ago, and we began doing a lot of things together in those years of life, and brought together by Newbigin's writings, actually. He said, would you help me create a curriculum for the young theologians in my diocese here? Would be Newbigin informed? I said, sure I will. So we created a curriculum together to do what? To help the young pastors of the Diocese of Pittsburgh to think more theologically about their life as pastors of churches in the diocese. I brought Newbigin to Washington, D.C. one time, invited Alden Hathaway and John Rogers to come from Pittsburgh to come for a weekend together to listen to Newbigin speak about lots of things. But he written a book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, which Alden Hathaway gave to me initially in my life. It's the question, you see, if it's a secularizing, pluralizing, globalizing world all day long. What Newbigin's asking is it possible for the gospel that claims to be true just to be meaningful in a pluralizing society and world? Not even a possibility. Because you see, the pluralizing world says, nothing is true like that. No, nothing's true like that. And Newbigin's asking the question, well, can we still speak about a gospel that says it's true in a pluralizing world? He reflects in chapter 10 on a conversation with a Hindu scholar. I'll read it here for you. The Hindu scholar is saying to Bishop Newbigin, I can't understand why you missionaries present the Bible to us in India as a book of religion. It's not a book of religion. In any way, we have plenty of books of religion in India. Why? Because it's probably the most pluralizing society in the world. We don't need any more. I find in your Bible a unique interpretation of universal history, the history of the whole of creation, history of the human race, and therefore a unique interpretation of the human person as a responsible actor in history. That is unique. There is nothing else in the whole religious literature of the world to put alongside it. I have to say to you, dear people, when I first read those words, it could be 35 years ago maybe now, literal chills ran down my spine. And it did for probably 2 or 3 years afterwards. It took me thinking, sheesh, how could you, Hindu scholar, see what most Christians can't see? If we were to walk into the churches of Charleston, Washington, D.C., pick the place in the world, how many of us could come close to saying, what's the Bible about? About this, you see. What would we say? In a pluralizing world, it is a completely unique book. No book like it in the history of religious literature. Why? Because what does it do? It presents a unique understanding of history, and a unique understanding of human being in history. And of course, the two go together. So the Hindu scholar could see into the depth, the richness, the uniqueness, the meaningfulness, the truth of the scriptures in a way that most of us as the church think, the Bible, okay, yes, okay. The Hindu scholar said, I asked him one day, who was this man? He said, well, he was a good friend over the course of decades. We didn't see each other all the time, but we get together, we would finally just begin to enter into the deepest things together, the deepest questions together. So what is the Hindu scholar saying here? He says, you see, this story that Augustine framed 1,500 years ago It's this story. A unique story. About what? About who we are as human beings. Nothing else like it. And of history. Nothing else like it. A story that makes sense of everything in history and everything about us as human beings in the world. That is profound, friends. That is profound. Meta-narrative is a good word, but not one we have to all use. Meta-narrative, as you see this story here, it's not only my narrative, my story, but meta-narrative is like the big story, a story that makes sense of everything in all of life and the world. How do we see the world? How do we see our lives in the world? You see, the whole thing, everything, all of life, all of reality, from beginning to end. I don't know any better way to put it than these 4 little words. Ought, is, can, and will. Becoming students of those who've gone before us, like Augustine, Newbegin, whose insights are worth prizing, have understood that there is to be a seamlessness between what we believe about God, about the human condition, about history, about the way we live and love, labor and learn, where we understand the artfulness of art, the importance of economics, the weight of politics, every square inch of the whole of reality of your life and mine. I could offer story after story of good people, men and women, every corner of the earth, known to God, unknown to most of us. But I'm going to linger for a moment here over a friend who's someone most of us know a little bit about. Her gifts have become woven into our lives, our loves, our liturgies. And her name is Sandra McCracken. A year ago this weekend, she and I did a retreat together in Texas. It's called the Laity Lodge. It's brought into being by a question, which is the heart of this weekend's conversation with you. Was it a family name, unfortunately named the Butt family, B-U-D-D, after all. And probably wish it was just Jones or something, or Smith, or Fitzsimmons, or Allison, or Schlabs, or it could be anything. But, these have been a family name, actually. They're the biggest grocery store company in Texas, H-E-B University. Everywhere. Even Costco, even, Walmart can't compete in Texas with H-E-B. It just dominates the market. 65, 7 years ago, H-E-B Jr., Howard E. Butt Jr., was a 20-something, intended to be the taker-up of the family business in the next generation. H-E-B Sr. had raised him to be that son. He became friends with Billy Graham, though, in his early 20s. Both discovered early in their 20s they had evangelistic desires and gifts. In the Southern Baptist culture of Texas and the Butt family, always evangelism would trump business women. You had a call from God to be an evangelist. Well, business would, of course, be way, way down here after all. For his 20s, Howard E. Butt Jr. wrestled with his calling. Who was calling him? His Father in heaven, his Father on earth. It actually was such a weighty question. He describes years later, it was a crisis in his own life. And in some ways, he was wounded by it for the rest of his life. By the time he was 30, his family had making enough money in Texas selling bread and milk. They began to think philanthropically and decided to buy a ranch in the hill country west of San Antonio to build a camp for kids who couldn't afford to go to camp. Interesting question, isn't it? We have money to contribute back to the flourishing of this part of Texas. How about a camp for kids who can't afford to go to camp? We'll call it the free camp. They gave Howard Jr. a little piece of the property along the Rio Frio, and he decided to build the Laity Lodge. To do what? Be a place where people could wrestle with this question this weekend. Who am I? Why am I? What am I going to do with my life? And so for 60-some years, the most favorite teacher for 60 years was Jack Packer. Who was his longtime conversation partner? Howard E. Butt Jr. Every year for 60 years, they talked together. One of the great moments of my whole life, we asked to do a retreat late in Dr. Packer's life with him at Laity Lodge. I could die and go to heaven now. Dr. Packer, we retreat at Laity Lodge. But last year, this weekend, actually, this second weekend of October, Sandra and I were together in a retreat at Laity Lodge. You see, dear people, Sandra is somebody who is as theologically mature as she is professionally competent. We were talking one night, she gave a concert one evening, and she described her great teachers, people who shaped her sense of calling as a musician. Francis Schaeffer, Alexander Schneemann, Wendell Berry, and Bono, a musician of U2. Thinking, Sandra, good for you, you know. I can imagine she grew up actually in a church in St. Louis, Presbyterian church called Covenant Presbyterian Church that Schaeffer used to pastor years and years ago. She grew up in that church. I get that part of it, Sandra, but, you know, the Russian Orthodox theologian Alexander Schneemann, you're pretty serious, you know, Sandra, aren't you? You know, you're very serious. When I teach vocation courses, I almost always begin my course on vocation with Schneemann's book called For the Life of the World. Wendell Berry, he's your teacher too, Sandra? That's surprising, but good for you. You know, the most prophetic voice in American literature, good for you, Sandra. And who else? Bono, you know, Bono himself, really. Thinking, Sandra, good for you. You know, it's a good constellation of teachers to shape your soul, your sense of calling in the world. I wrote this about Sandra, you know, after being with her last October. Bono the balladeer and poet, Schaeffer the apologist and pastor, Schneemann the priest and theologian, Berry the farmer and writer, and Sandra McCracken too. As theologically mature as you are professionally competent, not magic words, and there are other ways to account for a life that's more coherent, more seamless, one that's less compartmentalized and dualistic. But this vision is central to me, setting forth contours for the meaning of vocation that are real and true and right. Sandra McCracken is this kind of a person, uniquely and wonderfully. This past weekend, we were together at the Lady Lodge in Texas, her singing and me speaking. And for as long as it lasted, I treasured the hours, so enjoying the way she weaves together the deepest commitments about God and the world with her artful way with words, singing songs that nourish all with ears to hear. With uncanny insight and skill, she captures our deepest hopes and heartaches, our greatest longings and losses. This commitment to a way of seeing the integral character of all of life gave birth to Lady Lodge 60 years ago and still threads its way through generations later. By a strange mystery and wonder, all who come, if they're paying attention, have their imaginations baptized, driving through the Rio Frio, which is the only way in, each one coming to understand more completely the meaning of their lives and labors. One evening, Sandra sang across her own repertoire, from a beautifully imagined cover of U2's One to her song about the centuries who will feast in the house of Zion. And as she did, she told us about her own teachers, about the ways that Bono, Francis Schaeffer, Alexander Schneemann, Wendell Berry have shaped what she sees and hears. Yes, in one fell swoop, giving us a window into the whys and hows of her seeing and hearing so seamlessly. She offers all of us a vision of vocation, a way of making sense of all that we are and all that we should be. And from that commitment to coherence, singing songs for all of us, to all of us. You can see that I admire her a lot. There's a credo at the very heart of my own life. It is simply this, that vocation is integral, not incidental, to the mission of God, Missio Dei. Vocation is integral, not incidental, to the mission of God. I was in Nashville a few years ago having breakfast with a well-known musician and his neighbor, literally neighbor. He was a dermatologist in his late 30s in City Nation. Father been a dermatologist too, went off to a university in the South, gets involved in the campus ministry, goes to medical school, comes back home to be a doctor with his father and practice his father's study. And his friend, his neighbor, who I knew as his musician friend, had been talking about things I was talking about to him. He said, we're going to have breakfast together and Steve comes to town. We have breakfast together one morning and talk about these very things for about an hour and a half. This young dermatologist said to me as he began to wrap up our breakfast. And you know, if this is true, Steve, it just changes everything. What's true? This is true. If vocation, what I do with my life is integral to the mission of God, it just changes everything. But you see, what I've learned to think actually is what I do, it matters, but it's incidental. What really matters is what I do when I get home at night. You know, what happens on Wednesday night at my small group, what happens on Sunday morning I go to church. But the work I do, well, I make a good salary, you know, I'm a nice man in this community, but what I do, in fact, it isn't woven into the very meaning of God's work in history. It's incidental to it, actually. I've already mentioned John Stott, but in his own thinking about these questions, dear people, he says, if we get the mission of Christ right, thinking it through biblically, theologically, then first of all, we have to begin with vocation. He says we can't really understand or define the mission of Christ by rethinking, as he says, what the work of vocation means. It's been a profound argument for me. So just a question as we finish before our little break here. Who gets prayed for in our churches, people? Who gets prayed for and why? The librarians, the kindergarten teachers, the journalists, the shopkeepers, the homemakers, the coaches, the nurses, the physicians, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers. Mostly we don't, sadly, because we think that vocations of God's people are incidental to the work of God in the world. I spoke at a retreat like this some years ago in Virginia for a group of men for a weekend, a Friday night to a Sunday. Because all the men walked up to me and said, "Can we talk to you?" And I said, "Of course we can." One of them was obviously a Brit. He says, "I'm 50 years old. I want to say something to you." I said, I keep faith, a live faith when I was in my early 20s at university. And I lived in New York City for all these years. I was invited to come to the retreat by my friends here. He said, "You know, I have for 30 years thought that what I did with my life was pretty secular, pretty worldly. I've been a more serious Christian. I would like to be more religious with my life, more spiritual. Felt a little bit like a second-class Christian for most of my life." He says, "But you need to know that this weekend, a wound in my heart wasn't, I said, magic words that weekend. I'm not a magician. But you see, I was pressing into this more coherent, seamless vision of what a life in the world looks like, which is what we're doing again